Rory Stewart, welcome to 7:30.
Well, thank you very much for having me on.
Now, polls in the UK are suggesting a once-in-a-generation defeat for the Tories, an electoral asteroid heading for them, to borrow a description that was first used in the 1997 wipeout that brought in Tony Blair. Is it an asteroid that's coming for the Tories?
I think so. I mean, at the moment, it looks like whatever's bigger than an asteroid. I'm not good enough at physics, but it looks at the current polls as though they could be getting knocked down from where they are at the moment, which is up in the sort of high 300s, down to about 100 seats. That would be the worst defeat that they've suffered almost on record. I mean, there's nothing in the 20th century like this. And what makes it so strange is that only 4.5 years ago, they managed to win an unprecedented victory. So Labour was in the worst position they'd had since the 1930s. Now the Tories look like they're going to be in the worst position since the 19th century. And that just shows how volatile it is. In 4.5 years, you can flip from one extreme to the other.
And is that what we're looking at, the impact of those, particularly those 4.5 years with the chaos and the problems over COVID with Boris Johnson, and then the supercharged chaos of Liz Truss and her crazy mini budget with her Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng?
Yes, I think it's important to understand that, the Conservative Party traditionally in Britain was seen as a nasty party, but they were supposed to be kind of competent and serious. They brought in with Boris Johnson a dishonest, incompetent buffoon, and then they brought in with Liz Truss somebody who blew up the British economy. So they really lost this election almost immediately in 2019. They've been losing for 4.5 years. Add to that the fact that we're now in an age in Europe and the United States of populism, where governments in office are very, very unpopular because we're never delivering as much as we pretend we're going to deliver. And it then becomes very easy for Labour to sweep in. But of course, the problem being set up is what then happens in 5 years' time, because almost certainly Labour will also be unable to meet people's expectations.
Now, one of the elements that came into this campaign relatively early on was the somewhat surprise announcement by Nigel Farage that he would stand as an MP in this election. Now, for the benefit of any of our viewers who don't know him, the far right candidate, Nigel Farage, previously head of UKIP, very prominent during Brexit. What impact has Nigel Farage had on the campaign?
He's had a huge impact. And I mean, these things are so fascinating. And I'm looking forward very much to the Australian tour to look at the Australian parallels. But in this case, what's happened is the Conservative Party has tried to tack to the right. So they're talking a very strong game on immigration and rowing back on some of their green promises. That'll be familiar to many listeners. But of course, what's then happened is Nigel Farage has emerged even further to the right and totally stolen their strategy. So they've ended up absolutely stuck between a pretty centrist Labour Party and Farage, who's further to the right, with a vote base that's just collapsing around them.
Now, is this an election campaign phenomenon, or are we looking at a more profound alignment in British politics?
It's a huge change in British politics. Firstly, the old Conservative Party, which I belong to, which was a broad church, big coalition. It had, people like me who were more on the centre-left. We were all thrown out in 2019. So I was thrown out with Winston Churchill's grandson, with Ken Clarke, with lots of other cabinet ministers. It's now on a journey to becoming like Trump's Republican Party. Increasingly, MPs don't feel they can criticise the right with lurch, and it's getting itself locked into a populist space. Now, that's a space which could work for them electorally. I mean, after all, the Republican Party, is doing better than people anticipate in the US. Trump may win the election, but it's a very, very unpleasant place. It's a deeply depressing thing to happen to British democracy when one of your major parties tacks that far to the right.
Now, you just mentioned Ken Clarke, who left at the same time that you did. The sort of, one of the last connections to Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. Is that Conservative Party no longer in existence?
Well, I think it's the broader, older parties. So if we go all the way back, it's the party of Churchill, it's the party of Macmillan, and Heath is disappearing. what's happened is that Margaret Thatcher ran quite a broad party. She had people who were very right-wing economically like her, and then she had people who, you'll remember, who were called the Wets, who were generally meant to be more compassionate, more thoughtful about poverty and issues like that. It's that lot, what used to be called the Wets, that have been broadly kicked out of the Conservative Party. They've abandoned the centre ground, and I think they've also abandoned younger voters. I mean, when Margaret Thatcher was elected in 1983, she was leading with people aged between 18 and 25. The Conservative vote between people aged 18 and in their 30s now has just collapsed through the floor. Some people think that the very youngest voters, only 1% now will vote Conservative. And the Tories have only kept their lead in people aged over 65, who are retired people. This is a big mistake because it means you're turning away from the future towards people who are aging and who are not parts of cities, not parts of the most dynamic parts of the economy.
You're describing what you see as something frightening taking place inside the party you once loved and also within British politics. But there is clearly some appeal in Nigel Farage and perhaps what he's offering, or at least the messages that he's delivering. What is it that Nigel Farage says or does that means that some members of that 10%, whatever it is at the moment, is attracted to him?
Well, and it may be even more than 10%. I mean, sometimes he's right up at sort of 15%. Sometimes looks like he might even be getting ahead of the old Conservative Party. Why is he appealing? He's appealing because he just goes around saying the emperor has no clothes. He points out that all the technocratic centrist politicians make all these promises and don't deliver. So he'll say they're doing all this net zero stuff, they're never going to make it. They claim they're going to control immigration, but look at this, we got 1.5 million people in over the last couple of years. And it's appealing. You know, my mother, traditional Conservative voter, listens to Nigel Farage and she thinks, this guy talks a lot of sense. But of course, it's very cheap and easy because he's not actually running the government. I mean, in fact, almost anyone can play this game at the moment in Europe and the US because governments are struggling. The economy's not working, they're not delivering, they're often failing to meet their promises. So it's incredibly easy to get populist parties off the ground doing this, and you can see it in France and Germany and Italy as well.
Now, is this, do you think, a permanent change? Are you talking about a permanent change, shift towards a more populist right in the UK, or is this just a pendulum move that must swing back?
Well, I'm hoping it's a pendulum move because that's what happened after Tony Blair won in 1997. The Conservative Party went to the right and then it came back to the centre again with David Cameron. When I came in 2010, it was again voting for gay marriage. It was in favour of climate policies and all this kind of stuff. But I fear this may be permanent because something's changed in voters in the Western world. That old story, which was socially liberal, fiscally conservative, so voting for gay marriage but cutting taxes and balancing the budget, there's not much appetite for that now. Broadly speaking, voters now want more government spending, more borrowing, more taxing, and on the right, they want to be more socially conservative. They want to be more anti-immigration, they're leaning into culture wars. It's the sort of Trump package. So I'm worried in Britain, in fact, that this is a permanent change, that that party that I used to belong to, people, ask me whether I'm going to rejoin politics. That party, I think, is gone. And actually, the sort of offer which is being made by, for example, the Teal Independents in Australia, which is the kind of politics that would appeal to me, there's not much space for left in British politics, or I'm afraid European and American politics.
So, are you saying that this is a function of what's changing in the world rather than something created by the likes of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss?
Yeah, I think Boris Johnson and Liz Truss are symptoms. They're entrepreneurs. They're kind of shock jocks who respond to this upsurge. So is Nigel Farage. No, fundamentally what's happened is that our economy is not performing well. Cost of living's bad. Economy's in technical recession over 5 years. Wages are down. People think that we've no idea what we're doing internationally. Democracy doesn't really seem to be delivering for people. People are worried about their children. And they look around the world and they've just lost faith in the system. And what we're desperate for in all our countries is a democratic politics with real solutions. I'm a Democrat. I believe in democracy. I don't like people saying, well, China knows how to build roads and train lines, and, Russia seems to know what it's up to, and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf are showing what strong men can achieve. I don't believe in that. I think we should be very proud of our democracies, but we have to deliver. And that's the problem. We're not delivering for people.
Now, I've fallen into the trap that everybody seems to be falling into in talking about the UK election, that we've had all of the interview without talking about Keir Starmer, but there'll be time for that in the months to come. We look forward very much indeed to seeing you in Australia and following the election on the podcast. Rory Stewart, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.